Hi, everybody. I'm broadcasting from my home office this time instead of the shul, but I'm excited to still provide that in person virtual experience of the Dvar Torah for this week. This week's Parsha is Parshas Toldos, which is the only Parsha to feature Yitzchak in a central role, but even that ends up being somewhat complicated as we're about to explore. A well of living water. In many ways, more than being an agent in biblical history, our ancestor Isaac is acted upon. Most famously, he is the potential object of devotion and sacrifice in the Akedah. Just in last week's Parsha, his wedding is entirely arranged for him by an intermediary. He only meets his bride-to-be moments before their marriage is consummated. This fits with the Kabbalistic interpretation of Isaac as representing the sphera of Gevura, the aspect of God that receives what is bestowed. And in an event featured in this week's Parsha, we see this same dynamic play out once more. Immediately following a narrow escape from a foreign king who threatens to tear apart his family, that should sound familiar, Yitzchak Avinu settles in the land of the Philistines. However, the Philistines were concerned about the success Isaac had achieved and attempted to stop it. Literally. As it is written, and the Philistines stopped up the wells which his father's servants had dug in the days of his father Abraham, filling them with earth. Genesis 26:15. Rashi, in explaining this egregious act, first poses a very understandable reason for the Philistine interference. They were concerned about their national security. They imagined that the wells would become an attractive feature for potential invaders who would start a war to appropriate that natural resource buried underground. And who could ever imagine such a thing happening in the Middle East? However, drawing on the Targum Onkelos, Rashi offers a very different reading of what it means to stop up the well. The word featured in the Torah is sitamum, whose root is satam, which means to close up or to seal. However, the rabbis, instead of the triliteral root system of modern Hebrew, had a two-letter root system and saw the word timtam concealed within the Torah verse, which means to close off your heart, timtum halev. In a terrestrial perspective, a well is a source of that most essential natural resource, water. But we can translate the thirst and satisfaction that we receive from that water to the spiritual plane as well. The well is that which provides us with our most needed essence. In the last chapter of Masechet Brachot, after folios and folios of the intricacies surrounding the laws of blessings, the rabbis suddenly turned their attention to dreams. A significant portion of this parak is comprised of rabbinic oniromancy, that's a fancy word for dream interpretation, a fascinating peek into the interior life of our spiritual ancestors. On Brachot 56b, there is a question of how to interpret a well if one encounters one in a dream. Rabbi Chanina says that seeing a well brings peace, while Rabbi Nosson says that one will find Torah. Rava says it literally means life. In a way, all the rabbis end up being in agreement, as the well represents what is most central and essential to our spiritual life. The medieval Spanish commentator and mystic Rabbeinu Bachya, agreeing with Reb Nosson's reading, especially it seems, saw the well as representing the religious life to which Abraham introduced those he brought into the nascent Jewish fold. As he writes, these wells signify the converts who became Jewish during the time of Abraham, who became vessels to receive faith, just as wells are vessels to receive water. By digging, the Torah means the opening of the heart that was previously blocked. To Rabbeinu Bachya, the digging of the wells symbolized the opening of a life of faith, breaking through the barriers of one's sealed-off heart to allow in the flowing water of spirit. And this is why the Philistines interfered, as they were not connected to this source of living spirit. However, we are left with a question. How is it, in Rabbeinu Bachya's reading, that the Philistines were able to obstruct Isaac's connection to the Torah and presence of God? He was one of the 3 premier ancestors of our people with an intimate and personal connection to the Holy One. How could these people have gotten in the way? It's worth returning to the original verse to understand better the situation at hand. If we pay attention to the elements at play, we see that these were not really Isaac's wells at all. They had been dug by his father. And we saw that aspect reinforced in Rabbeinu Bach's interpretation, as the wells signified the connections to Torah opened up by Avraham and Sarah, not by Yitzchak. Of course, the Philistines were able to stop that up, as Isaac himself had no personal connection to these wells of Torah of his own. He was reliving the life of his father once again. We see here the same dynamic described above play out once more. Isaac is a passive recipient of influence rather than the active player in his own life. These were connections to God that were not personal and authentic to him, but rather ones he had inherited as the bearer of this transcendent legacy. I think this teaches us an essential lesson for our own spiritual lives. It is despairingly easy to lose our connection to Torah, to God, to faith, when it is premised on something that was never ours to begin with. If we are merely carrying on with Torah and Judaism because it was expected of us or because of the expectations of our parents or ancestors, then it will never be something we feel is actually ours. How can we pass that on to our own children, our grandchildren, or students in a way that they can receive as authentic to them, if we are not able to see it as authentic to us? Does Yitzchak learn this lesson? The verse that describes his response to this controversy implies that perhaps he didn't, that he is content being merely another link in the chain, a mere conduit for his father's influence. Genesis 26:18 reads, Isaac dug anew the wells which had been dug in the days of his father, and he gave them the same names that his father had given them. From this verse, it seems like Yitzchak merely wants to repeat the past, replay the greatest hits of Avram Avinu. The well, after all, in this reading, is a vessel, a recipient of water. It doesn't add, merely contains. Is that perhaps how Isaac saw himself? Thankfully, I think not. In the following verse, we see the result of what it is to take the shovel in one's own hands and dig one's own well. It reads, But Isaac's team, digging in the wadi, found there a well of living water, Be'er Mayim Chaim. Instead of letting the Philistines alienate him from a connection with God, and instead of allowing an inauthentic inheritance of Torah to be all that he possesses, Isaac takes agency and digs his own well, makes his own connection to God and Torah. And what he finds there is not a symbol of his passive recipient status, a mere vessel for water, but rather a Be'er Mayim Chaim, a well of living water. That is to say, not a mere well, but a spring. In digging to find his own connection to spirituality, Isaac is able to find something that not only receives, but generates, a source of water that flows, that is alive. So may it be for us. Shabbat Shalom.